The Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and your local cable provider presents Cable Reports. Join us now as Cable Reports brings you up to date on current issues facing the Commonwealth through discussions with your local legislators and other policymakers from across Virginia.
Welcome from the General Assembly in the City of Richmond. I'm Woody Evans for Cable Reports, brought to you by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and Comcast. We are honored to have a special guest today, Delegate McClellan, representing the 71st District. Tell us how things are going.
First, thanks, Woody, for having me. It's always a pleasure to be here. Things are pretty interesting, and we didn't waste any time getting started around here, so it's very busy and lots of issues coming at us fast and furious.
Let's talk a little bit about redistricting. Of course, I don't believe your district changed that much as a result of redistricting on the state level, but I think there's still quite a controversy surrounding federal redistricting. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. My district changed a little around the edges because we are a Voting Rights Act state. We can't have any minority-majority districts retrogress too far, and mine fell to about 42% African-American voting age population, mainly because of all of the regentrification and people moving back into the city and the growth at VCU. On redistricting for the congressional level, the fight really came down to two competing values of the Voting Rights Act. One is you don't want any one district to retrogress, but a second is you don't want to pack all of or a majority of the African Americans or minority populations into one district, thereby diluting their voting strength in other districts. And so the bill that we passed, which a lot of people are calling the Incumbent Protection Bill, because it basically makes all the Democratic seats more Democratic, the Republican seats more Republican, but it moved Petersburg from the 4th Congressional District into the 3rd Congressional District, and so now that district has most of the cities that are heavily African American: City of Richmond, Portsmouth, Petersburg, Hampton, Newport News, and Norfolk, and the concern is that by having so many African Americans packed into the 3rd, it has a 56% voting age African American population. The next largest percentage is 33%, and I think the 4th district. And so, I raised the concern on the floor that this pretty much guarantees that the minority community in only one congressional district can elect the candidate of their choice, and with African Americans alone making up 20% of the Virginia population, plus with the growth of minorities in Northern Virginia, we really should have had a district with a higher percentage. The argument to that made by the Republicans was, well, we didn't want the 3rd congressional district to retrogress too far. Ultimately, the Justice Department will decide who is right. And now that the bill is passed, and I'm sure the governor will sign it. But the other controversy is whether or not it's even constitutional for us to do redistricting now. The Constitution says you have to do redistricting in a year that ends with a 1, 2011. And because we did not finish redistricting in 2011, there are 2 court cases right now looking at whether we missed our constitutional window to do it, and therefore the courts should have done it.
Now, is that the state constitution that has that odd year requirement?
It is. I think the U.S. Constitution as well. Yeah.
So that bill has passed the Senate. It's subject to Department of Justice review,
yes.
But there are lawsuits based upon the fact that the legislature did not address redistricting at the congressional level in 2011.
That's right.
Okay, well, we'll stay tuned. Another very significant issue that's being debated this 2012 session relates to voter suppression. Talk to us about what that means and all the implications relating to it.
There are a lot of bills that have been introduced to arguably address voter fraud, even though the patrons admit that they have no evidence of a problem of voter fraud in Virginia. But these bills, whether they're intended to or not, will have an impact on keeping people from voting. The most pernicious of these is a bill, I think on the Senate side, introduced by Senator Martin, that would require a government-issued photo ID to vote. And the problem with that, there are a number of problems, but the two biggest problems with that is to get a government-issued photo ID now, you need a birth certificate. Well, many Virginians who were born before the end of World War II don't have birth certificates.
And why is that?
A number of reasons. First of all, we weren't required to record any births until, I believe, 1912. Second, not everyone was required to record a birth. If you weren't born in a hospital, oftentimes it was up to you, the parent, to go and register the birth, and not very many of them did. But then in 1924, there was an act passed called the Racial Integrity Act. And as part of that act, when you recorded your birth, you had to record one of two options. You were either white or colored. And so you had a number of people, particularly Native Americans, and I've read stories of Pamunkey Indians in particular, or if you had mixed blood people who did not identify themselves as colored, who would refuse to check the color box. And there was an individual named Dr. Plecker who was the one responsible for issuing birth certificates. If you did not check the box for colored, and you had, I think it was 1/16 of African American blood, or back then it was color blood, in your system, he would refuse to give you a birth certificate. And I've read particularly stories of some of the Pamunkey Indians who particularly refused to check colored. They weren't issued birth certificates. And when you look at the census after that, the Native American population in Virginia dropped significantly, in large part because of this act. And so a lot of non-whites were denied birth certificates. And this was as late as 1946.
Well, was this Dr. Plecker a state or local official?
He was a state official. I don't remember his exact title, but basically he was in charge of vital records. So he was the man who issued birth certificates in Virginia and recorded them.
So whatever happened to this Racial Integrity Act? Is it still on the books?
No, it eventually, I can't remember whether it was declared unconstitutional, but it's no longer on the book. So the other issue, so even if you have a birth certificate, to get a government-issued photo ID, you have to pay for it. I think it's maybe $10. You can get one from DMV. If you don't have a driver's license, you can just get an ID. But that's a poll tax, which was struck down, made illegal by the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And so, that bill in particular sets up significant barriers to the elderly, the minority communities, and the poor.
So we will continue to watch this, obviously. I believe there's another bill on the House side that if you don't produce a photo ID, you're allowed to cast a provisional ballot. Does that help at all?
No. Well, a provisional ballot won't always count, and you have to read that bill with another bill that basically will say, provisional ballots are counted after the election at what's called the canvass, where they go back through and sort of officially count all of the ballots. And there's another bill that would say that if provisional ballots are challenged and when they're being reviewed, the voter can come in, but no one else. So if you hire a lawyer, your lawyer can't come in. And so it's, if you read those two bills together, again, that's putting barriers in people's way when there's been no evidence, and Delegate Cole kind of admitted in the committee hearing that he has no evidence of voter fraud in Virginia.
Now, this seems to be a nationwide movement. There are a number of states that have adopted these voter ID requirements. What do you read into that?
I think, well, the fact that they're being introduced on the eve of the 2012 election, I don't think is a coincidence. And so I think it is a concerted effort to keep certain people from voting.
Now, you mentioned the Jim Crow laws. Can you give us a little bit more background on that? Because I don't think a lot of our viewers understand that period in our history.
Sure. It's a very dark period in our history where it's not just Virginia. I mean, there were a number of states in the South, but including Virginia, passed a series of laws that basically made colored people second-class citizens. It was everything from you had to sit in the back of the bus, to separate drinking fountains, to being prohibited from sitting at the counter at Woolworths, to, in the voting area, poll taxes, literacy tests, bills that prohibited whites and blacks from marrying, and then, I talked about the Racial Integrity Act. That sort of was their way of implementing that. So you had a law that said whites and blacks can't marry, and then you have to register whether you're white or colored, and that's a way for them to figure out who's violated this law or not. And I mean, it's as simple as, after Brown versus Board of Education desegregated the schools, and then a lot of the schools, in at least 5 localities, they closed the schools just to say, well, we're not going to desegregate our schools. So most of those bills were either struck down by the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, or were declared by the U.S. Supreme Court as unconstitutional.
And as you mentioned, there was a miscegenation statute, I believe, from Virginia that went to the U.S. Supreme Court.
Yes.
And there were covenants and restrictive covenants in deeds that prohibited African Americans and other minorities from owning property for a long time.
That's right.
Now, another issue that adversely affects our racial minorities relates to suspensions and expulsions in our school systems. Can you talk to us about that?
Sure. I've been working with Just Children, which is an advocacy group for children in the Commonwealth, and particularly poor children, and they commissioned a study to look at long-term suspensions and expulsions in Virginia and sort of what impact are they having on our students. And those studies show that that those punishments are disproportionately used on African American or minority students. And they also showed a correlation between those punishments and dropout rates once students drop out, they become targets for gang recruitment, and it really is having sort of not the intended effect. Rather than deterring bad behavior, they're not deterring bad behavior, first of all, and second, they are leading to underperformance in our communities. And so at their request, I've put in a package of bills. One is a study that asks JLARC to study the use... And JLARC is the Joint Legislative Audit
and Review Committee.
Sort of an independent auditing agency that studies a wide variety of issues for us. I've asked them to look at the use of long-term suspension and expulsion in Virginia and answer a series of questions about how it's used and its impacts. As far as I know, there's no opposition in that bill. In fact, I've met with a lot of education stakeholders, and they all think that study is a good idea.
Do you have examples of the kinds of expulsions that have occurred?
Yeah. Some localities have a zero-tolerance policy, so they may have technology offenses, which means you can be suspended if you bring your cell phone to school. And they'll have students who bring their cell phone to school, may not even be using it, but it rings in the classroom, and they have a zero-tolerance policy, and that student gets long-term suspension. There are some behaviors you obviously want to be able to expel or suspend a child. Violent activity, bringing weapons to school. But again, sometimes there's a zero tolerance for that, and I've heard of instances where a student had a bottle of Tylenol in her coat pocket because she'd been having headaches and she forgot to take it out, and she was expelled. Or you have, I read somewhere, I think there was a kindergarten student who brought a butter knife to school in her lunchbox so that she could cut her peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and zero tolerance policy, she's expelled. So I have another bill that would say you cannot use expulsion or long-term suspension just for technology offenses or sort of minor disruptive behavior. Then I have another bill, and again, school divisions are different. So in some areas, when they do suspend a child, they send instructional materials home, but some don't. and our Constitution requires every child to receive an education. So I have another bill that says if you use long-term suspension or an expulsion, you have to provide some sort of instruction for that child. And then I have another bill that would require school divisions already report to the Board of Education the various statistics on their use of these procedures. And I have a bill that would require that information to be made publicly available so that we can see what school divisions are doing without having to issue a FOIA request.
Now, what about young women who become pregnant? Are they adversely affected, or is there a policy that allows for them to continue their education in a different environment, perhaps?
That's a very good question. There are, the biggest problem for girls that become pregnant and who keep the child is daycare. And what do they do? And there are a lot who end up having to drop out because they can't afford daycare. Or in some jurisdictions, the waiting list for daycare is so long that they can't get in. And so there are some schools that are having a pilot program to offer daycare in the school. And I don't know of any instances where someone's been expelled or suspended for being pregnant, but there is just that simple question of what do you do with the child during the day that keeps a lot of girls from succeeding in school.
Right. I also heard of a case recently that has resulted in the introduction of a bill regarding parent notification when children are having issues in school. I don't know if you're familiar with that. There was a situation, I believe, in Northern Virginia where a young student was charged with having drugs on the school premises. He was interrogated over a number of weeks. His parents were never notified until the very end, and he wound up committing suicide.
Yeah, I've heard a lot about that story. Very tragic story, and haven't seen that bill, but I sit on the education committee, so I know I will see it. And I'm not at all surprised that that bill was introduced.
Now, another major issue as a result of the Affordable Care Act relating to health care gives the states an option to create what's called a health exchange. Can you talk to us about what's going on there?
Sure. Under the federal health care reform law, states were required to either set up their own exchange or default to the federal government to set up an exchange. And basically what an exchange is it's sort of a marketplace where individuals and small businesses can purchase health insurance. It sort of pools all of the products available to them, and they can, you go to the exchange and kind of shop around for a specific policy. And unfortunately, and I would say healthcare exchanges were around before the federal law passed. At least a couple of states, I believe Massachusetts, has exchanges already in place. And states were required to have their exchanges in place by the beginning of 2013 and up and running by the beginning of 2014. Unfortunately, Virginia's exchange is getting wrapped up in politics. Last year, we passed a bill that said we want to set up a state exchange, and then the governor's Health Reform Advisory Commission looked at the exchange and recommended specific ways that we should set up a state exchange. Then the governor said, I don't think we should go forward with this right now. Let's wait and see what the Supreme Court does with the federal act. But there are many of us who believe, including the Republican chairs of the House and Senate Commerce and Labor Committees, that we shouldn't wait. We should move forward now and take steps to put our exchange in place, because if we don't act now, we run the risk of the federal government not believing that we're serious about having a state exchange, and then they will impose the federal exchange on us. Or if you wait too long, then you're rushing at the end to try to get your exchange in place by the deadline. There's also federal funding available to fund your state exchange, and we run the risk of missing out on those funds. And if you're going to do an exchange, there are lots of very complicated questions that need to be answered on sort of the details of it. The longer you wait to begin those conversations and have a board in place to make the decisions and the rules to govern the exchange, you're going to rush, and whenever you rush anything, chances are you're not going to do it right. So I believe the committees are going to hear the bills, and hopefully enough people will recognize we need to move forward. We'll see.
But what is the administration's rationale for waiting beyond the Supreme Court's review of the Affordable Care Act? Is there some fear about what the Affordable Care Act will require for the Commonwealth of Virginia?
Well, I don't think they like the Affordable Care Act or what it means for Virginia, and I think they're hoping that the Supreme Court will strike it down in its entirety. And I know every single exchange bill has a provision that if the Supreme Court overturns the federal act, then our exchange goes away. So that shouldn't be a concern for our exchanges. I think the governor is also concerned if we move forward, then it implies that Virginia, and by extension he, somehow are complicit in implementing the federal exchange. Don't think that's a valid concern, because last year we already made decisions that we will take steps to implement the federal act if it remains in place. And the governor made budget decisions that assume that the act stays in place. In particular, his cuts to the health care safety net, our free clinics, that get, I think, cut by 50% this year and 100% next year, because he assumes with the federal act in place and the increases in eligibility for Medicaid and these exchanges, that the needs for the free clinics will go away. So I think it's pure politics, and I think those of us who want to be sure that an exchange is done right don't think we ought to be held hostage by the politics.
Now, the gravamen of the complaint against the Affordable Care Act relates to this individual requirement that everyone, to the extent you can afford it, get health insurance.
Right.
And that's the primary issue pending before the U.S. Supreme Court.
That's right.
Okay. There's also some legislation in the General Assembly regarding personhood. What do you understand about that legislation and its implications?
I'm very, very, very concerned about that bill. And again, I come at it from a different perspective on sort of the unintended consequences. What that bill does is basically says, for purposes of Virginia law, life begins at conception. And you can get into a whole debate on exactly what that means, but I think what the patron means is when sperm and egg meet. He claims that the purpose of that is so that if someone kills or causes a miscarriage, you can have a cause of action to sue them. For example, you get in a car accident, you kill the mother and also the child, then you have 2 counts of manslaughter or two lawsuits. So
there's no such cause of action, either civilly or criminally, now in the Commonwealth?
For causing the death of an unborn child, per se, no. But I do think that there are other things that someone could be charged with. But here's the concern. That bill can also be used to outlaw contraception, to ban abortion if Roe versus Wade is ever overturned. It can be used to criminalize the health care decisions of a woman and her doctor. But it also, take it outside of the context of, most people, when they think about abortion, they think about, the stereotypical promiscuous woman who gets pregnant and doesn't want to have the baby. What they don't realize, though, is in Virginia, there is no codified definition of abortion. The procedure used to end an unwanted pregnancy is the exact same procedure that is used to complete an incomplete miscarriage. So, and I had a lot of opportunity when I was pregnant 2 years ago to talk to my doctor about this. And she told me, real life stories of, a couple of examples. If you have a woman who, think the octomom, a woman who has a multiple pregnancy, the chances of each individual child surviving are slim. But if you reduce the pregnancy to 2, the chances of those 2 surviving are better than 50%. So if personhood passes, and each of the 8 is a person, are you going to have to get a guardian ad litem to represent each child to determine whether or not she can have an abortion? Is she, and while the bill says you can't go after the mother criminally, could the husband, if he disagrees, go after the doctor? There are other examples where, and again, you got to look at all the bills that have been introduced. There is a bill that would require, before you have an abortion, the doctor has to give you an ultrasound and ask you if you want to see it. And I think there's another one that's asked if you want to listen to the heartbeat, which is emotional blackmail on its face. But again, in the context of a wanted pregnancy, I have a friend who in her 8th month of pregnancy had a miscarriage. She went in for a regular checkup, and they discovered the baby had died. She had to go back for a medical procedure, which technically was an abortion. Put yourself in her shoes, and the doctor has to say, I now have to do an ultrasound. Do you want to see it? And do you want to listen for a heartbeat? Knowing perfectly well there will be no heartbeat. I mean, and we have a responsibility to not just think about what's the stereotypical provision that these bills will apply to, but think about the unintended consequences. And there are a lot of unintended consequences for pregnant women in all of these bills. Again, personhood, another example is I have another friend who had a cesarean, got pregnant again, and the doctor highly recommended she have a second cesarean. She was determined she was going to have a natural birth. Personhood passes, do you have to have a court decide? Can the hospital force her to have a cesarean? So I think these are all the issues that we really need to address on these bills.
So have these bills been heard yet on either side, the House or the Senate?
Not yet.
Okay, but you will obviously be a participant on the Senate side in those discussions.
Yeah.
I wanted to circle back for just a moment again on voter suppression, because I wanted to get your view on whether the things that are going on not only in Virginia but in other states are part of a pattern. But do you think it's based upon ignorance and the need to educate people about our history as opposed to racism?
I think there's probably a little bit of both. I'm not naive enough to think that racism is dead, period. But I do think the bigger danger is ignorance, and there are a lot of people who didn't live through Jim Crow, didn't live in an area where they were impacted by Jim Crow, can't fathom Jim Crow, and don't realize the impact that it had on communities and how public policy that's introduced now could have a disproportionate impact on those communities that were directly impacted by Jim Crow.
Great. Well, thank you for being here, Delegate Jennifer McClellan.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching Cable Reports, brought to you by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and Comcast. Until next time, I'm Woody Evans. Thank you.